Thank you all for joining tonight. Hopefully I can keep you awake and share some of the information that DEC is thinking about and things that you could be thinking about as far as deer management on your own properties. So to start out, I'd like to go over some basic ecology and natural history. And basic terrestrial ecology tells us that most terrestrial ecosystems have three trophic levels: the primary producers, or the plants, what eats those plants, or our herbivores, and in this case, that's deer that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and then what eats the herbivores. And we have our apex predators, and historically in New York, those have been wolves, mountain lions, and us as subsistence hunters, and our mesopredators, which are black bear, coyote, and bobcat. And then we also have these abiotic factors, especially severe winters with deep snow, that have really historically helped keep deer populations in balance with available habitat. And this was the system that really kept deer populations in check for much of their history across the Northeast. In fact, when subsistence hunting transitioned to market hunting, deer populations almost went extinct in much of the Northeast. In New York in particular, there were only remnant populations of deer left in areas of the Adirondacks that then had to repopulate the rest of the state. Now let's fast forward to present day. We no longer have wolves or mountain lions, and as a result, there's been less predation on deer, allowing populations to increase. Subsistence and market hunting is also no longer as, market hunting is no longer allowed. Subsistence hunting may be happening in certain families, but isn't widespread anymore. And that has widely transitioned to, actually, let me back up. So what I'm demonstrating here is what's called a trophic cascade. So when herbivore populations increase, we would expect that plant populations or vegetation would be affected negatively because they are browsing on that vegetation. And so again, as subsistence and market hunting transitioned to recreational hunting, and the other form of human mortality of deer was deer vehicle collisions, deer populations were again allowed to increase and vegetation was compromised. And we also know that we're not getting as severe of winters as we used to get. Climate change is making our winters more mild, and we're not getting those instances of deep snow, which have historically reduced deer populations in areas of the Adirondacks and Catskills. This has also allowed deer populations to increase in certain areas. And again, vegetation has been compromised as a result of that in many areas. We also have to remember that over that transition period, over that period of time, the last 100 years, the habitat has been changing. You know, these large swaths of primeval forest that would have been present prior to European settlement now look more like this, where they are fragmented. We have a lot more agriculture on the landscape. We have a lot more early successional habitat on the landscape, a lot more lawns and landscapes. And all of this has been to the benefit of deer. Deer have a lot more food that they can utilize, primarily from agriculture and landscape plantings. And this has also resulted in increases in the population. So thinking about all that, it shouldn't come as a surprise that our forests look different and are bearing the impacts of deer overabundance in certain areas. And so that first series of slides that I showed, that animation, made it seem like our forests are declining. I want to make sure that I'm not emphasizing that. That's actually not what's happening. What's happening is that the diversity of our forests is declining and the structure of our forests is being affected. So a typical forest has an understory, a midstory, and an overstory. And as a result of overabundant deer and deer browse in many areas of the state, our forests now look like this in the lower left portion of the screen, where we only have mature trees. The trees, the juvenile trees, the seedlings and saplings and pole saplings are no longer there. And that means that that forest is under threat because there's not trees to replace those mature trees when they die. The other thing that's happening is that the understory is transitioning from species that from species that deer would prefer to species that deer don't prefer. So instead of having trilliums, orchids, things that deer really like to eat, we have understories that are more comprised of invasive plants like Japanese barberry, grasses, which deer don't readily consume, ferns, and other species that deer just don't eat as readily. And even in instances where harvest is occurring, in some instances, in the top left here, where the light limitations have been removed, the canopy is open, and seedlings should be jumping for the sky and growing readily, deer are browsing them off, and we can't get the forest to regenerate in certain areas. So obviously this is a problem that we need to address. And we know that deer are the primary driver here because when we exclude them from these areas, this is what we see. So these are all pictures of deer exclosures, and you'll see the fence on the inside is where deer have been excluded. On the outside is where deer remain, and the vegetation is responding. It takes time, but in most instances, we see very good recovery over a period of multiple years. And there's numerous examples of this across New York State, and even in Ithaca on some of the Finger Lakes Land Trust properties. There are some exclosures that you can go and see this firsthand. We also know that deer aren't the only species in this system. We have a variety of other species that rely on that understory vegetation, primarily small mammals, amphibians and reptiles, insects and invertebrates, and ground nesting birds. And there have been numerous studies that show that when that vegetation layer in the understory is compromised, these other species are affected. And this is what's referred to as a trophic ricochet. I kind of demonstrated that top-down trophic control as a result of deer overabundance and impacts on vegetation. That lack of vegetation just sends this pulse of impact back up through higher trophic levels. And in some instances, this has been documented up through 3 additional trophic levels over a period of decades. So all these other species that are in the system are also impacted when there isn't the food available in the understory, or there isn't the habitat that they need to survive. And here's an example from my own research that demonstrates this. So this was research that I conducted in Ithaca, where I planted out 4 different species of plants. We have red oak here, blue stem goldenrod, zigzag goldenrod, and whitewood aster. And I planted them out in paired exclosures and open areas. So the hashed bars are where our plants that were planted in exclosures, and the bars that don't have a hash are in the adjacent open area. And what we saw across the board is that there was increased levels of rodent activity feeding on those plants when they were excluded from deer. And interestingly, those plants also had higher levels of survival, even though they were being fed on more by rodents. So again, this kind of gets to the point that deer are the primary mechanism of reduced plant survival in these systems. And if you exclude deer from the system, other species will benefit. We also need to recognize that this has negative consequences for the deer themselves. So when deer exceed habitat carrying capacity, it can have negative consequences for them. First, it starts off in the form as reduced body weight and condition. It can also manifest in reduced antler size. But this is kind of the worst case scenario, where deer have been above carrying capacity for a period of time. We get a harsh winter with deep snow, and large numbers of them starve in the middle of winter because there's not available food for them. So obviously this isn't good for deer either. And we hate to see this. We want to make sure that that deer are in balance with available habitat so that this does not happen. There's also implications for disease spread. The past 3 years, New York has been impacted by a disease called epizootic hemorrhagic disease. And what we've noticed is that it seems to spread much more rapidly and have greater impacts in areas where deer are abundant. Now, we just have gone through this as a society, how disease transmission works in high density situations. So this makes perfect sense. If we have high deer densities in certain areas, diseases will spread faster and affect more individuals. There's another disease called chronic wasting disease that's not in New York yet, but could get here. And again, similar evidence suggests that if you have high deer densities, it will spread much faster and kill off larger numbers of deer because it's able to affect so many of them. And here's just a map of the EHD outbreak from the past 2 years. I guess my point here is that this is probably going to become more common in New York. Prior to 2020, the only EHD outbreaks that we had were in 2007 and 2011. And now we've had it for the past 3 years in New York. So this is going to happen more commonly. It's going to affect more areas of the state and likely result in large die-off events that we experienced in 2021, where we received thousands of reports across the state of deer dying in people's yards, under people's porches. And so the map here shows the density of reports that we received in the shading by county, as well as where EHD was confirmed in those counties. So again, in those areas where deer densities were abundant, in particularly the lower Hudson Valley, we had the greatest impacts. And I know this talk is focused on impacts to forests, but we also need to think about the impacts to us. Deer are associated with the spread of tick-borne diseases, Lyme disease in particular. They cause billions of dollars of economic damage each year in the form of agricultural crop damage and damage to landscape plantings. And they cause thousands of deer vehicle collisions each year. And I want to reference this article that just came out a couple weeks ago in the Washington Post. They say, "Fear the Deer crash data illuminates America's deadliest animal." And their research found that deer are responsible for the deaths of about 440 of the estimated 458 Americans killed in physical confrontations with wildlife in average each year, making deer the most dangerous animal in the United States. So the question becomes, from my standpoint, how can we restore balance? And I like to think about this quote from Aldo Leopold, where he said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends to do otherwise." So thinking about all those things that I just shared, I think it's pretty obvious that something's wrong and that we need to be doing something about it as best we can. And so the next part of my presentation, I'm going to transition to what DEC is doing to try and address this issue, and hopefully get you thinking about some of the things that you can be doing as well. So the first part of this really needs to focus on deer population demography. What drives deer population growth? And to demonstrate this, I want to show you the basics of a population model focused on white-tailed deer. Populations start with juveniles. Here we have a juvenile doe fawn and a juvenile buttonbuck. And there's a certain probability that those fawns will survive to become adults. There's also a certain probability that those adults will survive another year to continue being adults. And then the does, in particular, have a certain fecundity rate for producing new fawns. The doe adults produce fawns each year. And interestingly, with white-tailed deer, even the doe fawns can produce offspring their first year. And so my point here is that where we have the biggest bang for our buck for reducing deer populations really focuses on the does. Because when you remove a doe from the system, not only are you removing that individual, but you're removing all of her future offspring. So if you just remove a buck, you're removing just that one individual, but there's no offspring being affected. If you remove a doe, especially a young doe, you could be removing 20 or 30 additional future does that would have been added to the population if she had not been removed. And that's the way that managers think about population management, and why DEC's management focuses so much on doe management. So thinking about these two system states that I demonstrated earlier in the presentation, I would argue that neither one of them is sustainable. The first one almost resulted in deer being eliminated or extirpated from New York. Obviously, we don't want that. But the other one here on the right is obviously not suitable either, because our forests are bearing the consequences and other wildlife are bearing the consequences. So we need to find kind of this middle ground where deer are in balance with available habitat. And so what are our various options? Let's first use the law of exclusions here. We know that we can't rely on deer vehicle collisions to do this for us. That's just not an ethical option. We also know that we can't control the weather and that trends with climate change are not boding well for that to be a major contributor to deer population decline in the future. So what does that leave us with? Well, we can either have recreational hunters act more like subsistence hunters or market hunters, and that's some of the strategies I'm going to be talking about tonight. Or we can also think about returning apex predators to New York. Well, let's think critically about that aspect for a second. Let's remember that the habitat has changed. So for one, mountain lions and wolves are not going to be able to do well in the areas where deer management is needed most. Yes, maybe they could establish populations in the Adirondacks, maybe parts of the Catskills, but I don't see them playing much of a role in Westchester County, for example. What about recreational hunting in this situation? With such human density, I'm not sure that's a viable option here either. So in some instances, there's going to be the need to resort to other methods. There's also a management challenge here regarding social acceptance. So would the people in this community want to have wolves or mountain lions? I could probably guess what the answer is there. Would the people in this community want to have recreational hunting? That might be also contentious. So thinking forward, in many of these situations where social acceptance isn't there for alternative management solutions, culling is probably going to be necessary. And this is very controversial. I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. It was very controversial in Ithaca when it occurred. But it's often necessary in instances where recreational hunting or other management solutions are no longer able to do the job. So where do we go from here? Hopefully by now you kind of have the sense that this is a very complicated issue and there's no easy solutions regarding deer management. But I'm going to share with you some of what my vision is and what I think DEC's vision is to try and address some of this. First off, I'd love to see more people engaged in hunting. And I'd love to see more landowners opening their property to hunting. I'd also like to see more hunters not focusing so much on big antlers, but really focusing on doe management and population management to ensure that the habitat is suitable for the deer population. I'd also like to see more people fully utilizing the venison food resource. This is a picture of my freezer. I supplement all of my red meat intake with venison. And not only does this provide benefits from a management standpoint, but it provides health benefits and it provides environmental sustainability benefits that anyone can utilize. I'd also like to see more people engaged in impact monitoring. So I'm glad to hear that the Finger Lakes Land Trust is engaged in monitoring the forest regeneration on its properties as it relates to the deer management that's occurring. That's a huge step in the right direction. And it can provide DEC the high resolution data necessary to inform adaptive management. In some instances, we don't have high resolution data to really inform our decisions, and I'd love to have that available. And I'd also love to see more municipalities engaged in urban deer management. As I mentioned before, there are going to be instances where recreational hunting is not something that we can readily utilize, and more cities need to be engaged in how to develop urban deer management programs. And many of these things are articulated in our most recent management plan for white-tailed deer in New York State. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're very, very close to some of the things I just mentioned. So allowing deer management permits throughout the northern zone, removing the prohibition on big game hunting in certain parts of Albany, Erie, Herkimer, and Hamilton County. These are all things that we'd like to see happen so that we can actually deploy the management that's necessary in certain areas. It also articulates our management intensity as it relates to management scale. And this is what I'm going to go through on the remainder of my presentation tonight. So at the statewide or wildlife management unit scale, recreational hunting is the primary tool that we have at our disposal. As that scale declines, we can increase our management intensity, and we have tools available to do that. So for example, we can extend seasons, and we did that in certain areas of the state last year. So for example, in areas of the Hudson Valley where we weren't meeting our population objectives, we extended the hunting season by an additional week or two to hopefully drive additional take in those areas. At the town or municipal level, we can work with communities to establish urban deer hunts. You may have heard of the deer management focus area in Tompkins County. This is an example of this, where the deer density in Tompkins County was so high, they needed additional assistance from DEC to address population growth, and we established the deer management focus area as a result of that. Excuse me. And then at the more local level, we have various permits that are available to property owners. So we have a deer management assistance program, which provides landowners additional doe tags that recreational hunters can use during the hunting season. And then on an individual property that's experiencing severe deer impacts, we have deer damage permits, which allow deer to be taken outside of the hunting season. So I'm gonna go through each one of those levels again and provide some additional context on how we set our goals. So at the state or wildlife management unit level, we kind of go through a tiered process to establish our desired deer population objective. And the first thing we do is evaluate forest regeneration and forest regeneration debt across the state. And what that means is there a dearth of seedlings and saplings making it into the overstory? Or is there a mismatch in the species that are in the understory versus what's in the canopy, indicating that there's not the same species replacing what's there? And so this is a paper by Miller and McGill in 2019 that describes this regeneration debt. Here's a couple maps from that publication. So the one on the left shows the average number of seedlings across the state, and the map on the right shows the average number of saplings across the state. And so what's striking here is that if you just looked at the map on the left, you might say, hey, situation doesn't look that bad. But if you look at the map on the right, obviously something's going on. What's happening is that there's seedlings that pop up after seed drop, but those seedlings are getting browsed and not making it into the sapling stage. That's what's indicated by those gray hash areas on the right-hand map. And obviously deer are one of the primary drivers doing that. There's other things that contribute to that lack of forest regeneration, but deer are certainly in the mix. The next step in that process is to establish where deer are the primary driver of that lack of regeneration, and can we drive the population down enough to improve the situation? So this is based on a paper by Martin Lesser et al. In 2018. And similar series of maps here where he modeled where a percent reduction in deer population, how it would improve seedling density. So for example, the map on the top left shows a 25% herd reduction. And you would see that in certain areas of the state, it does result in improvement. Like areas of the Hudson Valley, we see a slight increase and even a moderately high increase in the red. Similarly, in the Finger Lakes region, we see a very high increase in seedling density if we were able to reduce the population by 25%. And as the population is reduced more and more, we see improvement, even more improvement. However, what's the feasibility of 75% herd reduction? Probably zero. That's really not something that we're going to be able to drive in most cases. So probably the 25%, maybe closer to the 50% is the more realistic scenario and something that DEC may have control over. We also assessed public preference for deer population change. And this is a routine survey that we send out to the public, a randomized survey affecting all stakeholders. And we're basically asking, would you like to see more deer, fewer deer, or about the same deer in your area? And that results in a desired deer population trajectory for each wildlife management unit across the state. So each unit receives a designation of decreasing the population, maintaining the population, or increasing the population. And after that the most recent round that we went through, this is how the outcomes shook out. In areas of the Hudson Valley and Finger Lakes, our objective is to decrease the population by at least 25% by 2030. And in other areas of the state, as of now, the objective is to maintain the population or keep it the same. Moving down to the next level of management scale, at the town or municipal level, we have resources on how to develop an urban deer management program. So on the left is our community deer management guide. I would encourage you to take a look at it if you are interested in trying to establish a management program. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the deer management focus area in Tompkins County kind of serves as a model for how municipalities can establish an urban hunt framework if they're dealing with excessive deer impacts in their community. And then at the local level, which is more the property level and can also be implemented at a town or municipal level, we have these individual permits. So again, we have deer damage permits, excuse me, which allow deer to be taken outside of the recreational hunting season, and provide certain ways to take deer that are not normally allowed under recreational hunting. So, for example, deer can be taken at night under certain instances. Deer can be shot over bait in certain instances. So this is probably the most intense level of management we have available. And then we also have the Deer Management Assistance Program, which provides additional antlerless deer tags to property owners that can be used by hunters during the recreational hunting season. So there's permit applications on our website that you can review. Basically, you need to be able to demonstrate that you're having impacts on your property and have tried other methods, and you can potentially receive one of these permits. And I think it's important to recognize that in some instances, we have to just fence the deer out. The instances that I'm referring to are where there are rare, threatened, or endangered species of plants that need to be protected. Sometimes it's going to make more sense to just fence those areas off than try and reduce the deer density to a level that would allow them to thrive. It's just a much more cost-effective solution. And this can be utilized on your own individual property as well. If there's certain areas that deer are impacting that you want to try and protect, by all means, you can establish a deer exposure. And I want to leave this picture as my last slide, because it really emphasizes to me what we want our future forests to look like. And that's on all of us. All of us need to think about what it is that we want our future generations to experience. And obviously, removing deer entirely, which is on the right-hand side, isn't what I would like to see. But I certainly don't want to see what's on the left either, where there's a complete lack of understory vegetation and diversity. So finding this happy medium, finding this balance is what my role is all about. And hopefully it sheds some light on our thinking in DEC and how you can become more involved in making that a reality for us. So with that, I will leave it there, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thanks, Brendan. We do have a few questions. I'm not sure if I understand this first one. The landscapes you're referring to, largely ornamental, non-native, and unhelpful? Question mark. I think maybe if you could just expand on what types of landscapes have the most damage from deer browse.
I think what what they might be referring to is the slide where I showed the understory with barberry. So those understories with non-native plants, the ones that typically thrive are species that deer don't eat readily. So barberry is a good example, buckthorn, honeysuckle, and they don't provide much wildlife benefit in general. So you kind of have these ecological deserts, so to speak, where the understory has been transitioned to non-native species, and that has implications for all the other species that rely on that native vegetation.
Great. Okay, what about birth control? Is that a viable option for population control?
So there's been a lot of research on this, and Cornell has taken a lead on a lot of that research. And the long and short of it is that unless the population is closed to immigration, that it doesn't seem to be very effective, and that lethal control is a much more efficient mechanism. So it's had some effect on island populations where there isn't immigration from surrounding areas. But what's been found in open populations is that if you establish a fertility control program in those areas, other deer from the surrounding area will migrate in and take the place of those deer that would have been there.
Okay, next is how much impact do coyotes have on the fawn population? Should hunting season for coyotes be reconsidered?
Should a hunting season for coyotes be reconsidered?
Yep.
Okay. So we know that coyotes do predate on deer, primarily fawns and individuals that are sick or old. So the level of mortality that they results in on the deer population is largely called compensatory. It's individuals that likely would have died anyways. So they don't seem to be driving population declines in any area, even when coyote hunting is restricted. So it doesn't seem to be a large factor in deer population declines in any area of the country. So the other aspect there is, if we were to restrict coyote hunting, would hunters comply? And there's some question there. I think that's something that'd be very difficult for us to enforce.
Someone is wondering how they apply for deer damage permits.
So if you go on our website and just search for deer damage permits, a link or a page will come up, and there will be a link to the application form, and you would submit those to your local regional deer biologist.
Okay. Are there other examples of New York State communities that have successful active deer management programs?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different communities throughout New York engaged in deer management. I always refer to the deer management focus area and all the work that's happening in Ithaca because that's what I know best, but there's management happening across New York State.
Okay, why not only give out doe permits for population control?
So we give out a lot of doe permits. In fact, certain wildlife management units, we have essentially unlimited doe permits that could be utilized by hunters, and they're not utilized. So the reality is a lot of hunters hunt because they want to harvest a buck. We need to harness that interest, but also encourage hunters to shoot does at the same time.
Okay, next is, are there public programs like the Fish and Wildlife Partners with Wildlife Program that would help finance large deer enclosures on private property?
There's been some discussion, I believe, with the Department of Ag and Markets, I want to say, on fencing financing to protect crops, but I don't know of a mechanism that funds deer exposures for ecological purposes.
Okay, I work at the Arnott Forest where there are almost no seedlings of the canopy trees. However, your deer objective map indicates that nothing should be done there to reduce the deer herd. What is the disconnect?
So the map that I showed most of the Finger Lakes region being in a decrease objective. I don't know exactly which wildlife management unit the Arnott Forest is in, but I can verify what's going on there. If I had to guess, it would be that public preference for deer population change was to maintain or increase. So even though there was a lack of regeneration, public preference was that we want to see the same number of deer.
Brendan, could you share just, I've always heard of as a measure, how many deer per square mile? And I'm just curious of the range around the state from, say, the Adirondacks, where it's fewer, to the Finger Lakes to Long Island. What is the range of population? How much variance are we experiencing?
Yeah, quite a bit of variance. So I think at the highest density in Ithaca, it was about 110 per square mile, or maybe even slightly higher than that. It's probably close to the highest that we've experienced in New York State. There's certainly places in Long Island that I would say are close to that density. But then you have areas of the Adirondacks that are probably less than 15 or 10 per square mile, especially in the High Peaks region. So there's certainly a much variation across the state.
All right, next question. Doesn't there have to be a lot of public education in order for communities to implement culling? Is this an initiative for DEC?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we actually used to have a staff person dedicated solely to that, working with communities to develop a deer management plan and establish a deer management program. Unfortunately, that position is no longer filled right now, but yes, we're trying to work with communities as best we can to educate and ensure that they feel confident in moving forward with those types of initiatives.
Okay, next question. What would be the best approach to protecting a 10-acre community park in a suburban area with heavy deer damage?
That's a pretty small parcel. You could certainly consider some type of deer exclosure, but you also don't want to limit, people being able to experience the property. So if there's certain areas that would work well for that, that's something I would certainly look into. Unfortunately, 10 acres is so small, you're probably not going to be able to influence deer population on such a small parcel. If you do remove some deer, there'll be immigration from the surrounding areas. So I'd encourage you to work with your neighbors and cooperating landowners in the area to hopefully extend the management influence that you can have.
Okay, if immigration is a problem with contraception programs, is it also a problem with culling deer, and to what extent?
Yeah, neither one is going to result in permanent declines. It's a steep reduction at first and then maintenance level. So very similar to any type of invasive species control, you're never going to completely eliminate the species. The goal is to get it down to a level that's more acceptable and then maintain it at that level, utilizing a lower level of resources each year.
Okay, as afforestation progresses on abandoned farmland, does the explosion of food provided by early succession on those lands decline over time, resulting in eventual decline in deer populations?
Yeah, so early successional habitat is certainly more productive, provides more forage per acre than, say, old growth forest. So you would expect that the population would increase when forage is readily available, and then start to decrease and stabilize as those forests mature.
Has taking of fawns ever been tried?
Fawns are harvested, well, not in the spring, but young of year individuals are harvested all the time during hunting season. So those are 6-month-old or 7-month-old deer.
Okay. Can you describe the impacts on other wildlife from deer exclosures?
From deer exclosures.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you put up a fence excluding deer, there's the likelihood that you're going to be excluding other species of wildlife, particularly larger species of wildlife. So you could be excluding coyotes, for example, black bear. But the other species, depending on the style of fence that you're using, usually are able to navigate across the fence. There are instances where birds will fly into the fence and become entangled, or, similar to when they just don't, see the fence when they're flying and become injured that way. But impacts are usually minimal. But there's certainly something to consider in the style of fencing that you're trying to select. The fencing that we typically use for exclosures that I was working on is called deer buster fencing. It's a kind of a nylon material, and it provides some cushion if animals run into or birds fly into it. They kind of just bounce off. So just look into the style of fencing that you're looking to implement. And ideally, you have some small openings along the bottom where small mammals and other species can navigate across the fence, and you're still keeping the deer out.
Let's see. Is there a good deer population density map or chart available for different towns and counties?
So determining deer population size and density is extremely difficult. There are cryptic species, and the level of monitoring that has to occur to try and get accurate estimates is extremely difficult. So what we have instead is relative abundance estimates. And that's based on our hunter harvest data, as well as our bow log data. And what bow log is every time a hunter goes out into the field, they can observe the number of deer that they see, as well as the sex of those deer. And that gives us a relative sense of the number of deer in that particular area. So the best maps that we have are based on those types of data, and those are available in the deer management plan that I shared, as well as our annual deer reports that we send out.
So it sounds like this person owns an acre and has 4 to 6 deer come through weekly, and doesn't want to fence her property. So wondering if you have any suggestions. She has a creek at the bottom of a hill in the back of her property and has tried to make some native habitat.
There are also deer repellents that you can purchase. You kind of have to test them out to see which ones will produce the level of resistance that you're looking for. I can't give any strong recommendations there, but that's certainly worth looking into on such small acreages. And again, if you can work with your neighbors to kind of expand your management influence across a larger acreage, that's going to be even more effective. Do deer enclosures produce results that don't represent a balanced deer to forest ecosystem? That's always an argument, that the complete exclusion of deer is not representative of natural conditions. No argument there. That being said, they are representative of lower deer densities. So even though they're not 100% realistic of what conditions would be, they give us a sense of what they would be. And I think that's their value. And there have been instances where enclosures have been used and directly manipulated the number of deer in those enclosures with very similar results. So you could look at the work by Stacy Nuttall in Pennsylvania, where they established deer enclosures that manipulated deer per square mile or deer densities. And that's the work that produced the trophic ricochet concept that I alluded to earlier.
How big does a tree sapling have to be immune from deer browse?
So ideally the branches would be 5 or 6 feet high, the lateral branches. Deer can get up on their hind legs to feed if they need to, but they're typically only doing that if they're food stressed. They like to be in that window of browse heights above, 15 centimeters to like 30 centimeters. That's their ideal feeding area. And so if you can get, the higher you get above that, the better. But if you want to make sure that's completely protected, around 5 or 6 feet is what you need.
Okay, so the woman with the 1 acre is wondering, are you saying I could buy a permit and have a hunter come to my property and harvest deer other than deer hunting time? I'm not sure what that means.
So depending on the situation, obviously having recreational hunters on your property is a great thing to try and do. They may be able to take some of the deer off your property and allow you to, achieve the results that you're looking for. If you're experiencing other levels of impact, you could consider applying for a permit. But again, on such small acreages, it's going to be very difficult to address the larger population issues that may be surrounding. So that's kind of the first step you need to explore is whether you can get recreational hunting on the property or use other forms of repellents or deer exposures to try and protect the area of interest on your property.
Okay, apologies if I mispronounce this term. Do you know if the leucistic genes from the population at the depot spread at all now that it is not entirely enclosed?
The leucistic genes, I'm assuming they're referring to the Seneca white deer.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Can you say the question again?
Yeah, do you know if the genes from the population at the depot, hold on one sec. Do you know if the genes from the population at the depot spread at all now that it is not entirely enclosed?
I mean, they'll certainly spread. The question is whether they'll manifest now that there's more mixing of the gene pool from a deer inside the fenced area and outside the fenced area. So the likelihood that gene would express itself is less.
Yeah, Brendan, specific to the depot, I've been told that that's a recessive gene, so that once the population ratio tips with more of the brown deer, it's not expressed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to roll back up here. If the politics of doe only permitting isn't acceptable because it will make hunters angry, oops, sorry. I have this tiny little chat window here. If the politics of doe only permitting isn't acceptable because it will make hunters angry, how about trying 1 year of doe only hunting and evaluating the impact? Perhaps every other year could be doe only.
So I'll just emphasize that we're actually engaged in a study right now to assess the motivations and values of hunters for harvesting antlerless deer. And down the road, we may try to explore different mechanisms to encourage hunters to harvest more antlerless deer. It's certainly something that a lot of hunters do. I'm a hunter myself. I took 5 antlerless deer this past year. And there's a lot of people like me. But the reality is that less than 3% of hunters take more than 1 deer a year, 1 or 2 deer a year. even though we know that they have opportunity to. So it's part of it is this level of education that I'm trying to share tonight. We need more people to understand the ecological and economic and societal impacts of high deer populations, and promote this stewardship ethos among the hunting community that they have a role to play in ensuring that deer populations are in balance with available habitat. And it's not all about antlers and trophies.
What is the law about how close to a house gun hunting is allowed?
So the setback distance from a house right now for discharge of a firearm is 500 feet. For crossbow, it's 250 feet. And for a bow, it's 150 feet. Unless you have landowner permission, I should add that. If you have landowner permission, you can be closer.
I think that's it. I think we got to everything.
Great. Well, Brendan, thanks so much for sharing some great information. And thanks everyone for tuning in tonight, because this is clearly a complicated issue that's not going to be solved overnight, but you know, the information you share is really helpful, and appreciate everyone being here.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.